The abandoned farmhouse sat like a forgotten gravestone against the red Utah cliffs, its windows dark as dead eyes. Jimboy Martinez had driven 12 hours from Phoenix to settle his grandmother's estate, expecting nothing more than dusty furniture and faded memories. But Leo, his German Shepherd mix, wouldn't stop whimpering at the portrait hanging crooked in the front parlor. A stern-faced Mormon pioneer woman whose painted eyes seemed to track their every movement. What Jimboy didn't tell anyone was why he'd really left Utah 15 years ago. As a former investigative journalist, he'd gotten too close to exposing corruption in the local church hierarchy before threats forced him to flee. Now, as Leo's claws scraped frantically at the wall beneath the portrait, Jimboy's hands trembled as he lifted the heavy frame. Behind it, a hidden compartment revealed documents that made his blood freeze. Names, dates, financial records, evidence of the very scandal that had destroyed his career. But someone else knew he was back, and they were watching from the shadows of the canyon. Why had his grandmother hidden this explosive secret, and who else knew it existed? Jimboy's fingers fumbled through the yellowed papers, his heart hammering against his ribs. The documents were meticulously organized, bound with a faded ribbon that crumbled at his touch. Bank statements from the 1990s showed massive transfers, millions of dollars flowing through accounts linked to names he recognized. Church officials, prominent businessmen, politicians, the very people who had branded him a troublemaker and run him out of town. Leo's whimpering intensified, and the dog began pacing in tight circles near the front window. His hackles stood on end, ears rotating like satellite dishes picking up some distant signal. Jimboy had learned to trust his companion's instincts over the years. In Afghanistan, Leo's predecessor had saved his unit more than once by detecting hidden explosives. This nervous energy meant danger. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows, and Jimboy realized how exposed he was. The farmhouse sat isolated in the canyon, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and silence. No cell service. No neighbors for miles. If someone wanted him gone, this would be the perfect place. Among the documents, one folder caught his attention. His grandmother's handwriting scrawled across the tab for Jimboy when the time comes. Inside, a letter bore his name in her careful cursive, "My dear grandson. If you're reading this, then the Lord has called me home, and you've come back to Utah despite everything. I know what they did to you. I know why you had to leave, but there are things you don't know. Things I should have told you years ago. The Martinez family has been keeping secrets for generations. Your great-grandfather wasn't just a ranch hand like we always said. He was a witness to something that powerful men wanted buried forever. When he tried to speak up, they destroyed him, made him disappear into the desert. I've spent my whole life collecting proof, waiting for someone brave enough to tell the truth, someone they couldn't silence. I always hoped it would be you. But be careful, mijo. They have eyes everywhere, and they've been watching this place since the day you left." Jimboy's hands shook as he continued reading. His grandmother detailed a conspiracy spanning decades. Church leaders, local government officials, and wealthy families covering up financial crimes, land fraud, and worse. She documented everything, creating a paper trail that could bring down some of Utah's most powerful figures. Leo suddenly bolted to the window, barking frantically. Through the grimy glass, Jimboy spotted movement on the ridge overlooking the farmhouse. A glint of metal, binoculars, or maybe a rifle scope. His blood turned to ice water. The letter continued with specific instructions. Hidden throughout the property were additional caches of evidence, backup copies stored in waterproof containers. His grandmother had been thorough, preparing for the day when someone would come looking. "They killed your great-grandfather when he wouldn't stay quiet," she wrote. "Don't let them do the same to you." A vehicle engine rumbled in the distance, growing louder. Jimboy stuffed the documents back into their hiding place and carefully repositioned the portrait. Leo's barking grew more urgent, his body rigid with tension. Through the kitchen window, Jimboy saw dust rising from the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. Someone was coming, and given the isolation of this place, it wasn't likely to be a social call. He grabbed Leo's leash and the most crucial documents, shoving them into his jacket. Whatever his grandmother had uncovered, people were still willing to kill for it. The same forces that had destroyed his career 15 years ago were still active, still watching. The engine's sound grew closer, and Jimboy could make out the outline of a black SUV navigating the winding canyon road. Time was running out. He needed to get away from the farmhouse before whoever was in that vehicle arrived. Leo pressed against his leg, sensing the danger. Together, they had stumbled onto something bigger than either of them could have imagined. The question now was whether they would live long enough to do anything about it. The portrait hung in what Grandma Rose had called a parlor, though Jimboy couldn't remember anyone ever sitting in the stiff back chairs or using the room for anything other than storing old quilts and mason jars. The oil painting dominated the far wall, depicting a stern-faced man in a black coat with piercing dark eyes that seemed to follow movement across the room. A small brass nameplate at the bottom read Ezekiel Thornton, 1847. Leo had planted himself directly in front of it, his golden retriever body rigid as a statue. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and a low whine emanated from his throat, not distressed but focused, like he was trying to communicate something urgent. "What is it, boy?" Jimboy approached the painting, studying the weathered brushstrokes and cracked varnish. He'd never paid much attention to it during childhood visits, but now he noticed details that made his skin crawl. The man's eyes weren't just stern. They held a cruel intelligence, and there was something dark stained on the white collar of his shirt, something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Leo's whining intensified. The dog lifted one paw and scratched at the wall beneath the frame. "You want me to move it?" Jimboy reached up, surprised by how heavy the portrait felt as he lifted it from its hooks. The frame was solid oak, probably worth something to an antique dealer. But as he tilted it to examine the back, a yellowed envelope fell to the floor. Leo immediately pounced on it, grabbing it gently in his mouth and bringing it to Jimboy like a prized fetch. The paper was brittle, the ink faded but still legible. "For my descendants, should the truth need telling. R.T. 1923. R.T. Rose Thornton," his grandmother's maiden name. Inside the envelope, 3 items made Jimboy's hands shake. A photograph of 5 men standing around what looked like a freshly dug grave, their faces grim in the harsh sunlight. A hand-drawn map of the property with an X marked near the old well, and a letter written in his grandmother's careful script. "If you're reading this, I'm gone and can't protect our family anymore. Ezekiel Thornton was my great-grandfather, and he was a monster." In 1857, he participated in something called the Mountain Meadows Massacre, where a wagon train of emigrants was slaughtered. But that wasn't his only sin. He killed 3 people right here on this land, people who threatened to expose what he'd done in southern Utah. They're buried by the old well, and their families never knew what happened to them. I've kept this secret my whole life because I was afraid. The church protected men like Ezekiel back then, and there are still people who would do anything to keep certain histories buried. But the dead deserve better than our silence. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone in town will want this truth to come out. Jimboy sank into one of the uncomfortable chairs, his mind reeling. His great-great-great-grandfather was a murderer, multiple times over, and 3 bodies were supposedly buried somewhere on his property. Leo padded over and rested his massive head on Jimboy's knee, brown eyes full of sympathy. Dogs always knew when their humans were struggling. "How did you know, boy? How did you sense something was wrong with that painting?" The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway made both of them freeze. Jimboy quickly stuffed the papers back into the envelope and shoved it into his jacket pocket. Through the parlor window, he watched a black pickup truck pull up beside his Honda. The man who got out was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a crisp white shirt despite the heat. He had the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A knock echoed through the house. Leo's hackles rose, and he positioned himself between Jimboy and the front door, letting out a low growl. "Mr. Hendricks, I'm Bishop William Crane from the local LDS ward. I heard you'd inherited Rose's place. Jimboy opened the door cautiously, noting how the man's eyes immediately scanned the interior of the house behind him. Nice to meet you, Bishop. I'm just getting settled in. Rose was a pillar of our community, a faithful woman who understood the importance of letting the past rest in peace. The bishop's smile didn't reach his eyes. I hope you'll follow her example. Some family histories are better left undisturbed, don't you think? The words felt like a threat wrapped in religious pleasantries. How could this man possibly know about the letter unless Rose had told someone, or unless there were people still watching, still waiting to make sure certain secrets stayed buried? I'm just here to fix up the house and decide whether to sell it, Jimboy said carefully. Of course. Well, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call. Bishop Crane handed him a business card, his fingers lingering just long enough to be uncomfortable. And remember, sometimes the kindest thing we can do for the dead is let them rest undisturbed. After the truck disappeared down the dirt road, Jimboy locked the door and pulled out the envelope again. Leo was right to be suspicious. Someone definitely didn't want him here. The question was, what were they willing to do to stop him? The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse kitchen as Jimboy nursed his third cup of coffee, his eyes burning from another sleepless night. Leo had stationed himself in front of the portrait again at dawn, that same unsettling whine emanating from deep in his throat. The dog hadn't touched his food in 2 days. Jimboy set down his mug and approached the painting with fresh determination. In daylight, the stern-faced man seemed less menacing, though his dark eyes still held an intensity that made Jimboy's skin crawl. The brass nameplate at the bottom read Ezekiel Hartwell, 1847 to 1923. Below that, in smaller script, Beloved Father and Pioneer. What's so special about old Ezekiel, boy? Jimboy scratched Leo behind the ears, but the dog refused to break his vigil. A knock at the front door made them both jump. Leo's hackles rose as he positioned himself between Jimboy and the sound, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Through the window, Jimboy spotted a black sedan parked in his driveway, definitely not a neighbor's vehicle. He opened the door to find a woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her navy suit looked expensive, completely out of place in rural Utah. Behind her stood a younger man with cold blue eyes and hands that rested too casually near his jacket. Mr. Hartwell? The woman's smile never reached her eyes. I'm Margaret Sinclair from the LDS Historical Society. This is my associate, Mr. Rivers. We understand you've inherited some family artifacts that might be of interest to our preservation efforts. I'm sorry, but how did you know I was here? Jimboy kept his hand on the doorframe, not inviting them in. Small communities talk, Mr. Hartwell. Word travels fast when historic properties change hands. Her gaze drifted past him into the house. We're particularly interested in any portraits or documents from the pioneer era. Your great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel, was quite an important figure in early Utah settlement. The fact that she knew the family connection sent alarm bells ringing in Jimboy's head. He'd only discovered Ezekiel's identity minutes ago. I'm afraid I'm not ready to part with anything just yet. Still cataloging what's here. Margaret's smile tightened. Of course. Perhaps we could just take a quick look? For historical assessment purposes only. Actually, now isn't a good time. Jimboy began closing the door, but Rivers stepped forward, his foot positioned to block it. We've come quite a distance, Mr. Hartwell, Rivers said, his voice carrying an edge that made Leo growl louder. Surely you can spare a few minutes. I said no. Jimboy's tone hardened. You're trespassing. I suggest you leave. Margaret raised a hand to calm her associate. We understand your position. Perhaps you could consider our offer instead. She produced a business card with a number written on the back. $50,000 for any 19th century portraits in the house. No questions asked. The amount was staggering, especially for someone facing mounting repair costs. But the desperation behind the offer, only confirmed Jimboy's suspicions that something wasn't right. "I'll think about it," he lied, taking the card. "Don't think too long," Rivers said as they turned to leave. "History has a way of disappearing if it's not properly preserved." Jimboy watched them drive away before deadbolting the front door. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and called the only person he trusted with weird family mysteries, his cousin Sarah, who worked as a genealogist in Salt Lake City. "Jimboy, how's farm life treating you?" "Sarah, I need you to look into our family history. Specifically, a guy named Ezekiel Hartwell from the 1800s. The name sounds familiar. Give me an hour." While he waited, Jimboy examined the portrait more carefully. The frame was original, heavy oak with intricate carving. Behind the canvas, something crinkled when he pressed against it. His pulse quickened as he carefully pried at the backing. Hidden between the canvas and the frame's backing was a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax that had somehow survived over a century. His name, or rather the Hartwell name, was written across the front in faded ink. Sarah called back just as he was working up the courage to open it. "Jimboy, where exactly did you find information about Ezekiel? There's a portrait of him here. Why?" "Because according to every record I can find, Ezekiel Hartwell died in 1874, not 1923. And here's the weird part. After 1874, there's no mention of him anywhere. It's like someone scrubbed him from the official church records." Jimboy stared at the envelope in his hands, then at Leo, who had begun pawing frantically at the base of the wall beneath the portrait. "Sarah, I think I'm about to find out why." The wax seal cracked under his thumb, releasing the musty smell of old secrets. Whatever was inside this envelope, people were willing to pay $50,000 to suppress it. And if Rivers' veiled threat meant anything, they might be willing to do much worse. The portrait's eyes seemed to follow Jimboy as he moved through the living room the next morning, coffee mug trembling in his hands. He'd barely slept, haunted by Leo's bizarre behavior and the strange sensations he'd felt when touching the frame. In the harsh light of day, he tried to convince himself it had all been his imagination. Stress from the move, grief over losing Grandma Eloise, the isolation of this remote farmhouse getting to him. But Leo was at it again. The German shepherd sat rigid in the exact same spot as yesterday, his amber eyes locked on the stern-faced man in the portrait. This time, a low whine emanated from deep in his throat, barely audible but constant, like a radio stuck between stations. "Leo, come on, boy." Jimboy patted his thigh. "Let's go outside." The dog didn't even twitch. His ears remained pricked forward, tail stiff as a board. When Jimboy moved closer, he noticed the fine tremor running through Leo's muscles, as if every instinct screamed at him to flee while something else held him frozen in place. Jimboy followed his dog's gaze to the portrait. The man depicted wore the severe black clothing typical of 19th century Mormon settlers, his dark hair parted with mathematical precision. A brass nameplate at the bottom of the frame read Ezekiel Harmon, 1847 to 1923. The name meant nothing to Jimboy, though given its placement in his grandmother's house, it had to be family. What struck him most was the man's expression. While most portraits from that era showed stoic faces, there was something else in Ezekiel's painted features, a coldness that went beyond Victorian formality. The artist had captured a cruelty around the mouth, a predatory gleam in the dark eyes that made Jimboy's skin crawl. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, echoing through the old house. At the sound, Leo finally broke his trance, shaking himself like he was shedding water. He looked up at Jimboy with confused eyes, as if awakening from a dream he couldn't quite remember. "That's better." Jimboy scratched behind his dog's ears. "You were starting to freak me out, buddy." While Leo padded off toward the kitchen, presumably seeking breakfast, Jimboy remained transfixed by the portrait. He'd grown up hearing fragments of family history from Grandma Eloise, stories of pioneers and plural marriage, of ancestors who'd followed Brigham Young into the Utah Territory, but she'd never mentioned anyone named Ezekiel Harmon. The house phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through his thoughts. He found the ancient rotary phone on the kitchen counter, its avocado green plastic a relic from the 1970s. "Jimboy? It's Martha Henley from down the road." The voice was crisp, efficient. "Thought I'd check how you're settling in." He remembered her from the funeral, a weathered woman in her 60s who'd known his grandmother for decades. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Henley. I'm doing fine, thanks. Still getting used to the quiet." "I imagine so, coming from the city. Listen, I was wondering if you'd given any thought to what you'll be keeping from Eloise's things. There's a historical society in town that would love to preserve some of the older items, if you're willing to donate." Jimboy wandered back toward the living room as they talked. "I haven't really gone through everything yet. There's more stuff here than I expected. Your grandmother was quite the collector. Lots of family history in that house." A pause. "Though some things might be better left alone, if you catch my meaning." Something in her tone made him stop walking. "What do you mean?" Another pause, longer this time. "Well, every family has its difficult chapters. The early settlers, life was hard back then. People did things they wouldn't normally do just to survive. Sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie." Leo had followed him back to the living room and was resuming his vigil in front of the portrait. The whining started again, soft but persistent. "Mrs. Henley, do you know anything about someone named Ezekiel Harmon?" The silence stretched so long he thought the line had gone dead. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, become carefully neutral. "Where did you hear that name?" "There's a portrait of him here. The nameplate says he lived from 1847 to 1923. Jimboy, I need to go, but take my advice. Some family history is better left buried. Your grandmother had good reasons for keeping certain things to herself." The line went dead, leaving him staring at the humming receiver. Leo's whining had grown louder, more urgent. When Jimboy looked at him, he saw the dog's hackles were raised, his lips pulled back to expose gleaming teeth. But Leo wasn't looking at the portrait anymore. He was staring at the window behind it, where a shadow had just passed by. Someone was outside, moving along the side of the house with deliberate stealth. Jimboy's blood turned to ice. The nearest neighbor was Martha Henley, and she lived 2 miles away. The photograph felt heavier than it should have as Jimboy turned it over in his hands. The back was yellowed with age, covered in his grandmother's spidery handwriting. Most of it was faded beyond recognition, but one line stood out clearly: "Samuel Whitmore, may God forgive us all." Leo whined softly from his position by the window, still fixated on the portrait hanging above the mantel. The dog hadn't moved from that spot for over an hour, his ears perked forward, occasionally letting out low growls that made the hair on Jimboy's neck stand up. "What is it, boy?" Jimboy murmured, but his attention remained on the photograph. The man in the image bore an unsettling resemblance to the stern figure in the portrait, though this Samuel appeared younger, less weathered. He stood beside a woman Jimboy didn't recognize. Both of them posed stiffly in front of what looked like the very farmhouse he now occupied. A sudden knock at the front door made them both jump. Leo's growl deepened, his hackles rising as he finally broke his vigil to position himself between Jimboy and the entrance. Through the lace curtains, Jimboy could make out a tall silhouette on the porch. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Jimboy tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her dark eyes swept over him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You must be Jimboy," she said without preamble. "I'm Sarah Caldwell. I live down the road." She gestured vaguely toward the east. "I knew your grandmother well." "Oh, hello." Jimboy tried to place her among the handful of people who'd attended the funeral, but her face wasn't familiar. "Would you like to come in?" Sarah's gaze shifted past him to the interior of the house, lingering on the mantel where the portrait hung. Something flickered across her features, recognition perhaps, or concern. "That's very kind, but I can't stay long. I wanted to offer my condolences and see how you were settling in." Leo remained tense beside Jimboy's leg, his eyes never leaving their visitor. Sarah noticed the dog's behavior and took a small step backward. "Your dog seems agitated," she observed. "He's been acting strange since we arrived. Keeps staring at that old portrait." Jimboy found himself studying Sarah's reaction carefully. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you? It seems to be some kind of family piece." The color drained from Sarah's face so quickly that Jimboy thought she might faint. Her hand gripped the porch railing for support. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should go." "Wait." Jimboy reached out instinctively, but Sarah was already backing away from the door. "Mrs. Caldwell, if you know something about my family's history, I'd really appreciate—" "Some things are better left buried," she interrupted, her voice stronger now but edged with something that might have been fear. "Your grandmother understood that. She was a wise woman." Before Jimboy could respond, Sarah had turned and was walking quickly back toward the road. He watched her disappear beyond the tree line, questions multiplying in his mind like weeds. Back inside, Leo had returned to his post by the window, but his attention was now divided between the portrait and the direction Sarah had gone. Jimboy pulled out the photograph again, studying Samuel Whitmore's face in the dim light. The man's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved, just like the painted figure above the mantel. The similarity between the two faces was undeniable now that he looked more closely. Were they the same person, just painted at different periods of his life? But that would make the portrait incredibly old, possibly dating back to the 1800s when this area was first settled by Mormon pioneers. Jimboy's phone buzzed with a text message, making him jump. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize. "Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Leave Millfield before something happens you'll regret." His blood ran cold. He'd been in town less than 24 hours, had spoken to maybe half a dozen people. Someone was watching him, keeping track of his movements and his questions. Leo's growl turned into a full bark, sharp and urgent. The dog was staring at the window now, his body rigid with alarm. Jimboy quickly moved to peer outside, but saw only empty fields stretching toward the mountains. Yet something felt wrong, a prickling sensation between his shoulder blades, the distinct feeling of being observed. The photograph seemed to burn in his pocket, as he realized that whatever secret his family had been keeping, it was bigger than he'd imagined. And someone was willing to threaten him to keep it hidden. The painted eyes of Samuel Whitmore watched him from across the room, and for the first time Jimboy wondered if inheriting this house had been a terrible mistake. The phone rang at 3 a.m, jarring Jimboy from a restless sleep filled with dreams of painted eyes that followed him through endless corridors. Leo growled low in his throat, ears pricked toward the hallway where the old rotary phone sat on a dusty side table. "Hello!" Jimboy's voice came out as a croak. Silence stretched across the line, punctuated only by the sound of breathing that wasn't quite human, too measured, too deliberate. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Leo padded to the bedroom doorway, hackles raised, staring down the dark hallway toward the living room, toward the portrait. Jimboy checked the caller ID, but the ancient phone didn't have one. He tried 69, only to hear an automated voice informing him the number was blocked. Sleep became impossible after that. Jimboy made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, researching everything he could find about Ezra Whitmore and the early Mormon settlers of Cache Valley. The internet connection was spotty, pages loading with agonizing slowness, but gradually a picture began to emerge. Ezra Whitmore had indeed been among the first wave of pioneers to settle the area in the 1850s. He'd established a successful farm and married a woman named Patience Blackwood in 1863. But there were gaps in the historical record, mentions of troubles in the community and references to church disciplinary action that were never fully explained. Most disturbing were the newspaper clippings from 1867. 3 separate articles in the Logan Herald mentioned the mysterious disappearance of several local families, including the Blackwoods. The articles were brief and vague, mentioning only that the families had departed for California under urgent circumstances. But Patience Whitmore hadn't gone to California. She was buried in the family plot behind the farmhouse, her grave marker weathered but still legible, beloved wife, called home 1867. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the kitchen, Jimboy heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Through the window, he watched a black pickup truck pull up to the house. The man who emerged was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Leo began barking before the man even reached the porch. The knock was firm and authoritative. Jimboy opened the door to find a stranger with pale blue eyes and prematurely grey hair visible beneath his cap. Something about his features seemed familiar, though Jimboy was certain they'd never met. "You, Jimboy Rasmussen?" "That's right. Can I help you?" "Name's Dale Whitmore. I understand you've been asking questions about my family." The surname hit Jimboy like a physical blow. He glanced down at Leo, who had positioned himself between them, still growling. The dog's instincts had proven reliable so far. "Come to think of it," Jimboy said carefully, "I don't recall mentioning the Whitmore name to anyone around here yet." Dale's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Small town. Word travels fast when outsiders start poking around in old business. What old business would that be? The kind that should stay buried. Dale stepped closer to the threshold, and Leo's growling intensified. "My ancestor built a good life here, contributed to the community. Don't see any reason to go stirring up old stories that can't be proved and wouldn't matter if they could. Seems like you're the ones stirring things up, coming here uninvited." Dale glanced past Jimboy into the house, his gaze lingering on the living room where the portrait hung. "That painting's been in your family for generations. Must be worth something to the right collector. I'd be willing to make you an offer." "It's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Not that." Dale nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "Your grandmother was a stubborn woman too. Caused herself a lot of unnecessary trouble with that attitude." The implied threat was unmistakable. Jimboy's hand found Leo's collar, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles. "I think you should leave now. I'll be in touch." Dale turned and walked back to his truck with unhurried confidence. Before getting in, he called back. "Might want to be more careful about locking your doors. A lot of accidents happen to folks who aren't properly cautious." The truck disappeared down the gravel road, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the acrid smell of diesel exhaust. Jimboy's hands were shaking as he locked the door and checked the other entrances to the house. Leo had stopped growling but remained alert, moving restlessly from window to window as if tracking something only he could sense. When the dog finally settled, it was in his usual spot facing the portrait, but his posture was different now, protective rather than mesmerized. Jimboy stared at the painted face of Ezra Whitmore and realized he was looking at features that bore a striking resemblance to the man who had just threatened him. Whatever secret the portrait held, the Whitmore family was still very much invested in keeping it hidden, and they were willing to do whatever it took to protect it. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke as Jimboy drove back from town, his truck's headlights cutting through sheets of rain. The manila envelope containing copies of Ezekiel Morrison's death certificate and the sparse police report sat on the passenger seat, its contents more disturbing than illuminating. According to the official records, his great-great-grandfather had died of acute cardiac failure in 1923, but the handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. Someone had scrawled possible poisoning and investigate family members in faded ink. Leo was waiting by the kitchen door when Jimboy pulled up, the dog's usual excitement at his return notably absent. Instead, Leo stood rigid, ears pricked forward, staring past him toward the portrait room. The behavior that had started this whole investigation continued, and if anything, seemed to be intensifying. "What is it, boy?" Jimboy asked, shaking rain from his jacket as he stepped inside. Leo whined softly but didn't move from his position, as if standing guard against something Jimboy couldn't see. The house felt different tonight. Smaller somehow, as though the walls were pressing inward. Jimboy attributed it to the storm. Old houses always seemed to shrink during bad weather, but as he walked toward the living room, he noticed other changes. The floorboards that usually announced his presence with familiar creaks were silent under his feet. The air smelled wrong, too, carrying a metallic tang that reminded him of old pennies. He flicked on the overhead light in the portrait room, and his blood chilled. The painting of Ezekiel Morrison had been moved, not dramatically. It still hung in the same spot on the wall, but it was crooked now, tilted maybe 10 degrees to the left. Jimboy was certain it had been perfectly straight when he'd left that morning. He was obsessive about things like that, a trait inherited from his grandmother along with the house. Leo padded into the room behind him, immediately resuming his intense stare at the portrait. This time, though, the dog's hackles were raised, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "Someone's been in here," Jimboy whispered, more to himself than to Leo. He examined the windows, all locked tight. The front and back doors showed no signs of forced entry, yet the evidence was undeniable. The portrait's heavy wooden frame would have required significant force to shift, and the picture wire showed fresh scoring marks where it had slipped against the hanging hardware. His phone buzzed with a text message, "Stop digging or join your ancestor." The number was blocked, the words stark against the blue screen. Jimboy's hands shook as he read it again. Someone knew about his research into Ezekiel's death. Someone who had access to his house and wasn't afraid to make threats. He checked every room methodically, Leo following close behind. Nothing else appeared disturbed, but that somehow made it worse. The precision of it, moving only the portrait, leaving everything else untouched, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the house and its contents. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to send a message. In the kitchen, Jimboy poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat at the scarred wooden table where his grandmother had served him countless meals. The police report's margin notes kept running through his mind. Investigate family members. What if Ezekiel Morrison hadn't died of natural causes? What if someone in the family had killed him, and now, a century later, that secret was threatening to surface? The bourbon burned, but it steadied his nerves enough to think clearly. He pulled out his phone and called the one person he trusted completely, his cousin Marcus in Salt Lake City. "Jim? Jesus, it's almost midnight." "Someone broke into the house tonight," Jimboy said without preamble. "Moved the portrait and sent me a death threat." The line went quiet for a long moment. "What portrait?" "The one of Ezekiel Morrison." "Marcus, I've been researching our family history, and I think there might be something—" "Stop." Marcus's voice was sharp, almost panicked. "Don't say another word over the phone. I'm driving up tomorrow morning. Don't go anywhere alone until I get there." The urgency in his cousin's voice sent fresh chills down Jimboy's spine. "Marcus, do you know something about this? About Ezekiel?" "Tomorrow, Jim. We'll talk tomorrow." The line went dead, leaving Jimboy staring at his phone in the kitchen's harsh fluorescent light. Even Marcus knew something. The family secret that Leo had somehow sensed was bigger than he'd imagined, its roots deeper and more dangerous. Outside, the storm was strengthening, rattling the old windows in their frames. Leo had positioned himself at the threshold between the kitchen and living room, facing the portrait room like a sentry. Whatever was happening, Jimboy realized, he was no longer investigating just a curious family mystery. He was caught in something that had been festering for generations. Something that people would kill to keep buried. The portrait of Ezekiel Morrison hung crooked in the darkness beyond, and Jimboy couldn't shake the feeling that those painted eyes were watching him back. The basement felt colder than it should have, even for October in Utah. Jimboy descended the creaking wooden steps, with Leo padding nervously behind him, the dog's earlier agitation now replaced by an almost reverent caution. The single bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the stone walls, revealing details he'd missed during his hurried searches for the circuit breaker. Behind the ancient furnace, partially concealed by decades of accumulated dust and cobwebs, stood a wooden cabinet he hadn't noticed before. Its dark oak finish matched the style of the portrait upstairs, and brass hinges green with age suggested it was original to the house. Leo whined softly and pressed against Jimboy's leg as they approached. The cabinet door opened with surprising ease, as if someone had oiled the hinges recently. Inside, wrapped in yellowed muslin cloth, lay a collection of daguerreotypes and documents. Jimboy's hands trembled as he lifted out the first photograph. The image showed the same stern-faced man from the portrait, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 women stood beside him, their faces bearing the resigned expressions of people who'd learned not to expect happiness. Underneath the photographs, bound with a red ribbon that crumbled at his touch, were letters written in spidery handwriting. The paper felt brittle as autumn leaves, threatening to disintegrate if handled roughly. Jimboy carried everything to the workbench beneath the single light and began to read. The first letter was dated 1857 and signed by Ezekiel Morse, the man in the portrait. As Jimboy read, the temperature in the basement seemed to drop further. Ezekiel wrote of sacred duties and blood atonement, terms that made Jimboy's skin crawl. The letter detailed a meeting with church leaders about families who had spoken against certain practices, families who needed to be silenced for the greater good. Leo began to growl low in his throat, staring at the basement stairs. Jimboy looked up from the letters, listening intently. The house above them was silent, but Leo's hackles were raised and the dog's body was rigid with tension. After a moment, Leo relaxed slightly, but continued to watch the stairs with suspicious eyes. The next document made Jimboy's blood run cold. It was a list of names, families marked for what Ezekiel euphemistically called divine justice. Next to each name was a date, and beside most of those dates, someone had drawn a small cross in red ink. At the bottom of the list, in different handwriting, was a note that made Jimboy's hands shake. The Henley children escaped. Search continues. Sarah Henley. The woman he'd found mentioned in the historical records, the one whose family had supposedly moved to California. According to this document, they hadn't moved anywhere. They'd been murdered, except for the children who had somehow escaped Ezekiel's righteousness. A photograph slipped from between the letters, landing face down on the workbench. When Jimboy turned it over, he found himself looking at a group of men in dark coats standing around what appeared to be a freshly dug grave. Ezekiel Morse stood in the center, his hand resting on a shovel. On the back, someone had written, "The Henley matter resolved. April 1858. But it hadn't been resolved, had it? The children had escaped, and Sarah Henley's descendants had survived. Jimboy thought about his grandmother's maiden name, about the genealogy records that seemed deliberately vague about her family's origins. His grandmother had been a Henley before marriage. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His family hadn't moved to Utah by chance. They'd been here all along, descendants of people who had escaped Ezekiel Morse's brand of justice. The secret wasn't just about historical murders. It was about bloodline, about revenge that had been simmering for over a century and a half. Leo's growling intensified, and this time Jimboy heard what had alarmed the dog. Footsteps on the floor above, slow and deliberate. Someone was in the house. Jimboy quickly gathered the documents and photographs, stuffing them back into the muslin wrapping. The cabinet door closed with barely a whisper. The footsteps paused directly above them, as if whoever was upstairs was listening as intently as they were. Jimboy pressed himself against the basement wall, pulling Leo close. The dog's body vibrated with suppressed barks, but he remained silent as if he understood the danger. A door opened somewhere upstairs. The sound of the front door, Jimboy realized with relief. The footsteps moved across the porch and faded away. After several minutes of silence, Jimboy crept up the basement stairs, clutching the wrapped documents against his chest. The house appeared empty, but something felt different. In the living room, the portrait of Ezekiel Morse hung slightly crooked, as if someone had examined it recently. On the coffee table where Jimboy had left his research notes, the papers were arranged differently than he remembered. Someone had been searching the house, looking for exactly what he'd just found, and they'd be back. The basement door creaked open, releasing a wave of musty air that made Jimboy's eyes water. Leo whined behind him, pressing close against his legs as he aimed the flashlight down the wooden steps. Each board groaned under their weight, and he half expected the rotting wood to give way entirely. The beam of light swept across the basement floor, revealing decades of accumulated junk. Cardboard boxes sagged against the stone walls, their contents spilling onto the dirt floor. Mason jars filled with unidentifiable preserves lined makeshift shelves, their contents now black with age. But it was the far corner that drew his attention, where the light caught something metallic glinting beneath a moth-eaten tarp. Leo growled low, the sound vibrating through the confined space. The dog's hackles rose as they approached the covered object, and Jimboy felt his own skin prickle with unease. He reached out with trembling fingers and pulled away the tarp. A large steamer trunk sat beneath, its brass clasps green with verdigris. The leather was cracked and peeling, but the trunk itself appeared solid. Carved into the lid were symbols that made his stomach lurch, the same angular marks he'd seen scratched into the back of the portrait upstairs. The clasps opened with surprising ease, as if they'd been recently maintained. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay dozens of photographs. Jimboy lifted the first bundle with shaking hands and carefully peeled back the protective covering. His grandmother's face stared back at him, but not as he'd ever known her. In this photograph she was perhaps 20 years old, standing in what appeared to be a candlelit room, surrounded by other young people. All wore white robes, and their faces bore expressions of rapturous devotion. Behind them, mounted on the wall, hung the same portrait that now watched over his living room. The next photograph made his blood run cold. The same group, but now they knelt around a prone figure lying on what looked like an altar. The person's face was obscured by shadows, but Jimboy could make out restraints around the wrists and ankles. His grandmother stood at the head of the altar, holding an ornate knife above her head. Leo barked sharply, causing Jimboy to drop the photographs. They scattered across the dirt floor like fallen leaves, each one revealing another piece of a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. Images of ceremonies, of symbols carved into flesh, of people who appeared to be screaming in silent agony. At the bottom of the trunk lay a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with age. Jimboy opened it carefully, squinting at the faded ink in the flashlight's beam. The entries were dated, beginning in 1952, the year his father would have been born. "The covenant must be maintained," read one entry in his grandmother's careful script. "Brother Morrison assures us that the chosen bloodline will carry forward the sacred duty. The vessel has been prepared, and the binding is nearly complete." Jimboy's hands shook as he turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed rituals, sacrifices, and something called the Eternal Watch. References to the portrait appeared frequently, described not as a mere painting, but as a window and a prison. A particular passage made his heart race. Young James grows stronger each day. Soon he will be old enough to understand his purpose. The blood of the covenant flows through him, and when the time comes, he will take his place as the guardian. The watchers in the portrait grow restless, but they know their release draws near. James, his father's name. Leo's barking became frantic, echoing off the basement walls. The dog was staring at the stairs, and when Jimboy followed his gaze, he saw why. A shadow moved across the light filtering down from above. Someone was in the house. Footsteps creaked across the floorboards overhead, slow and deliberate. Jimboy quickly stuffed the journal inside his jacket and gathered as many photographs as he could manage. The trunk's clasp snapped shut with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The footsteps stopped directly above them, and dust rained down from between the floorboards. Leo pressed against Jimboy's legs, trembling. In the sudden silence, they could hear breathing, measured and patient, as if whoever was upstairs knew exactly where they were and was simply waiting. Jimboy clicked off the flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. The breathing continued, and now he could swear he heard whispers, multiple voices speaking in low, urgent tones. The words were unintelligible, but the cadence was rhythmic, almost ritualistic. A door slammed somewhere above, making both man and dog jump. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of rapid footsteps moving toward the basement door. Jimboy fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal in the basement. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and a beam of light swept down into the darkness where they hid. Leo whimpered softly, and Jimboy pressed his hand over the dog's muzzle. "We know you're down there, James," called a familiar voice. "Sheriff Morrison, come up slowly and bring whatever you found with you." The floorboards groaned under Jimboy's weight as he descended into the root cellar, his flashlight beam cutting through the stale air. Leo had refused to follow him down, instead whining and pacing at the top of the wooden steps. The dog's behavior had grown increasingly erratic since they'd discovered the journal, as if he could sense something lurking just beyond human perception. The cellar stretched farther back than Jimboy had expected, carved directly into the hillside behind the farmhouse. Mason jars lined rough wooden shelves, their contents long since spoiled and blackened. But it was the far wall that drew his attention. Newer concrete, poured sometime in the last 50 years, judging by its color and texture. The rest of the cellar's walls were original fieldstone. He ran his hands along the concrete surface, feeling for irregularities. Near the bottom, his fingers found what felt like a seam. The concrete had been poured in sections, and this particular section seemed slightly different in texture from the rest. As he knelt to examine it more closely, his flashlight illuminated something that made his blood freeze. Dark stains had seeped through the concrete over the decades, creating rust-colored patches that could only be one thing. The smell hit him then, faint but unmistakable. Death, decay, something that time had tried but failed to completely erase. His phone buzzed, startling him so violently that he nearly dropped the flashlight. A text from an unknown number: "Stop digging or join them." The air in the cellar suddenly felt thick, oppressive. Jimboy's breathing quickened as he realized how vulnerable he was down here, trapped underground with only one way out. He scrambled back toward the steps, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. At the top of the stairs, Leo was barking frantically at something outside. Through the kitchen window, Jimboy could see headlights approaching down the long gravel driveway. His heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the truck, the same rusted Ford he'd seen watching the house before. The vehicle stopped just outside the circle of light from the porch lamp. Its engine ticked in the silence, but no one got out. Jimboy grabbed his grandmother's rifle from where he'd left it, leaning against the kitchen counter, his hands shaking as he checked that it was loaded. Minutes passed. The truck's headlights cut harsh shadows across the yard, and Leo's growling had taken on a menacing quality Jimboy had never heard before. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the truck's engine roared to life, and it reversed back down the driveway, disappearing into the darkness. But not before Jimboy caught a glimpse of the driver in his flashlight beam, an elderly man with sharp features and cold eyes that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen them before. The next morning brought Sheriff Morrison to his door, looking haggard and uncomfortable. The lawman accepted Jimboy's offer of coffee but barely touched it, instead fidgeting with his hat and avoiding direct eye contact. "Had some reports of disturbances out here," Morrison said finally. "Neighbors hearing gunshots, seeing strange lights." "I fired a warning shot last night," Jimboy admitted. "Someone was trespassing on my property." Morrison's expression tightened. "See who it was?" "Older man, driving a beat-up Ford truck. Rust-colored, maybe from the 70s. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring into his untouched coffee. When he looked up, his face was grim. "Jimboy, I've known your family for a long time. Your grandmother was a good woman, but this property, it has a complicated history." "What kind of history?" Morrison stood abruptly, as if he'd already said too much. the kind that's better left buried. Take my advice, sell this place and move on. Some secrets are meant to stay secret. After the sheriff left, Jimboy found himself drawn back to the portrait in the living room. The stern-faced patriarch seemed to watch him with knowing eyes, as if aware of everything Jimboy had discovered. Leo sat beside him, still fixated on the painting with an intensity that bordered on obsession. That's when Jimboy noticed something he'd missed before. In the background of the portrait, barely visible behind the subject's shoulder, was a building. The same barn that still stood on his property, but in the painting it looked newer, more substantial. And there were figures near it, small, indistinct shapes that could have been people. He grabbed a magnifying glass from his grandmother's sewing kit and studied the painting more closely. The figures became clearer, revealing what looked like a family group. A woman in a long dress, children clustered around her and standing slightly apart, a man who wasn't the portrait's main subject. The resemblance was unmistakable. The man in the background had the same sharp features, the same cold eyes as the driver of the truck, which was impossible unless the same family had been watching this property for over a century, guarding whatever secrets lay buried beneath it. The photograph trembled in Jimboy's hands as he stared at the face that could have been his twin. The young man in the faded sepia image wore a Union Army uniform, his eyes holding the same deep-set intensity that Jimboy saw in mirrors. Below the photo, written in his grandmother's careful script, Thomas Brennan, died 1863, Battle of Gettysburg. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, leaning closer. "Your family's been Mormon for generations. They would never have fought for the Union." Leo whined from his position by the portrait, pawing at the frame with increasing agitation. The dog's behavior had grown more erratic since they'd found the hidden panel, as if the very air in the room carried scents of long-buried secrets. Jimboy set the photograph aside and reached deeper into the cavity. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. He pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished black with age. Inside, a miniature painting showed a woman with kind eyes and auburn hair holding an infant. "There's something else," Sarah said, pointing to a folded paper wedged in the corner of the hiding space. The document crackled as Jimboy unfolded it. The handwriting was different from his grandmother's, older, more formal. As he read, the blood drained from his face. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "It's a confession, written by Ezra Whitmore." Jimboy's voice barely rose above a whisper. "He says Thomas Brennan was his son, his biological son." The implications hit them both simultaneously. If the confession was true, then the Whitmore family's pristine Mormon lineage was built on a lie. Ezra had claimed Thomas as his nephew, the orphaned son of a deceased brother, when in reality the boy was his illegitimate child. "But that would mean," Sarah began, "that I'm not really a Whitmore, at least not in the way the family believes." Jimboy sank into the dusty armchair, the weight of generations pressing down on him. Thomas survived Gettysburg according to this. He came back to Utah, married, had children. The whole story about him dying in battle was fabricated. A floorboard creaked overhead. Both of them froze. Leo's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. The sound came again, deliberate footsteps moving across the second floor. Jimboy grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the cellar entrance, but the basement door slammed shut above them with a resounding bang. The lock clicked into place. "No, no, no," Jimboy muttered, rushing up the steps and throwing his weight against the door. It didn't budge. The footsteps overhead grew louder, more confident. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to hide anymore. Sarah fumbled for her phone. "No signal down here." Leo began barking frantically, his attention split between the locked door and the portrait that still hung askew on the wall. In the weak light of their phones' flashlights, the painted eyes of Elder Whitmore seemed to follow their movements. "There has to be another way out," Sarah said, scanning the cellar walls. Jimboy remembered his grandmother's stories about the Underground Railroad, about houses with secret passages. Mormon settlers in Utah hadn't participated in that particular network, but they'd had their own reasons for building hidden routes: federal raids, religious persecution, the need to move people and goods without detection. He began examining the stone foundation more carefully, running his hands along the mortar joints. Near the far corner, behind a stack of mouldering wooden crates, his fingers found a section where the stones felt different, looser, more recently placed. "Help me move these boxes," he whispered. They worked quickly, the sounds from upstairs growing more ominous. Glass shattered somewhere in the kitchen. Drawers slammed open and shut. Someone was searching the house methodically, violently. Behind the crates, a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrowed tunnel that disappeared into blackness. Stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of earth and long-buried secrets. "I'm not going in there," Sarah said, backing away from the opening. Another crash from upstairs, closer to the cellar door this time. Leo barked once more, then fell silent, his tail tucked between his legs. "Don't have a choice," Jimboy said. He grabbed the confession, the photograph, and the locket, shoving them into his jacket pocket. "This tunnel has to lead somewhere." The cellar door rattled as someone tried the handle. When it didn't open, heavy footsteps retreated, but only for a moment. Then came the distinctive sound of splintering wood, an axe or crowbar attacking the doorframe. Jimboy pushed Leo into the tunnel first, then helped Sarah climb through the narrow opening. As he squeezed through himself, he could hear the cellar door giving way behind them. Flashlight beams swept across the basement floor. The tunnel stretched ahead into absolute darkness, hand-carved through solid rock generations ago. As they crawled forward, guided only by the faint glow of their phones, Jimboy wondered how many other family secrets lay buried in the Utah soil and whether they would live long enough to uncover the truth. The basement smelled of earth and secrets. Jimboy's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls that predated the house above. Leo pressed against his legs, whimpering softly as they descended the wooden stairs that groaned under their weight. "Easy, boy," Jimboy whispered, though his own nerves were fraying. The metal detector in his free hand felt heavier with each step. The basement stretched further than he'd expected, extending beyond the footprint of the house. Hand-hewn support beams disappeared into shadows, and the packed dirt floor showed signs of disturbance, patches, where the earth had been dug up and hastily refilled. Leo's behavior grew more agitated as they moved deeper. The dog's nose worked frantically, following some scent trail that made him circle and pace. When they reached the far wall, Leo began pawing at a section of loose stones. Jimboy knelt beside him, running his fingers along the mortared joints. Several stones shifted at his touch, revealing a cavity behind them. His pulse quickened as he worked the stones free, creating an opening large enough to reach through. His hand found cloth first, old rotted fabric that crumbled at his touch, then something harder, cold. He yanked his hand back, bile rising in his throat. Bones. The metal detector's sweep of the basement floor revealed 3 more buried anomalies, each registering the telltale signature of metal. Buttons, belt buckles, jewelry. Jimboy marked each spot with chalk, his hands trembling as the full scope of what lay beneath his grandmother's house became clear. This wasn't just about one family secret. This was a graveyard. Leo's barking upstairs shattered the basement's oppressive silence. Urgent, warning barks that sent ice through Jimboy's veins. Someone was here. He clicked off the flashlight and grabbed Leo's collar, pulling the dog close. Footsteps crossed the floor above, heavy boots that knew exactly where they were going. The intruder wasn't trying to be quiet. The basement door creaked open. Light spilled down the stairs. "Jimboy, I know you're down there." Bishop Cartwright's voice carried a deadly calm that made Jimboy's skin crawl. "You've been asking too many questions. Poking around where you don't belong." Jimboy pressed himself against the stone wall, Leo trembling beside him. The bishop's footsteps descended slowly, deliberately. "Your grandmother was a good woman," Cartwright continued, his voice growing closer. She understood the importance of keeping certain things buried, family loyalty, community protection. But you're just like your father. The mention of his father made Jimboy's blood run cold. His father had died when Jimboy was 12, a hunting accident, they'd said. But now, standing in this underground tomb, he wondered what other lies had been built on bones and silence. Thomas started asking questions too, the bishop said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. His flashlight beam swept the basement, started digging into church records, genealogy documents. He found references to the missing families from the 1890s, the ones who supposedly moved away in the night. Leo growled low in his throat. Jimboy tightened his grip on the dog's collar, knowing that one bark would give away their position. Polygamy was complicated back then. Cartwright's voice carried across the darkness. When the federal marshals started cracking down, some families had to be relocated permanently for the greater good of the community. The flashlight beam passed inches from their hiding spot. Jimboy could see Cartwright now, the same man who'd delivered countless Sunday sermons, who'd blessed babies and married young couples. But the face caught in the upward glow of his flashlight looked ancient, carved from shadow and malice. The early settlers had to make hard choices, Cartwright continued. Sometimes faithful families had to disappear to protect the rest. Sometimes children who might talk had to be silenced. Your great-great-grandfather Ezra understood. He provided the service the community needed. Jimboy's mind reeled. His family hadn't just been involved, they'd been the executioners. This basement was where the inconvenient faithful had been brought to die. But Thomas couldn't let it rest, just like you. Cartwright's flashlight found the disturbed stones, the chalk marks on the floor. He was going to expose everything, destroy families who've lived with this secret for generations. So we had to stop him. The hunting accident, not an accident at all. Your grandmother made us promise to leave you alone as long as you stayed away. But here you are, following in your father's footsteps. Cartwright's beam swept toward their hiding place again. Some bloodlines just can't help themselves. Leo's muscles coiled under Jimboy's hand. The dog was preparing to spring, to protect his master the way he'd been bred to do. But Cartwright would be armed. In this confined space, they'd have no chance. Unless they could reach the old root cellar exit he'd glimpsed earlier, a narrow tunnel that led up to the barn. It would mean abandoning the evidence, but evidence meant nothing if they were dead. The bishop's footsteps moved closer. In the darkness, Jimboy made his choice. The basement felt different now that Jimboy knew what lay beneath the concrete. Every footstep seemed to echo with accusation as he descended the creaking wooden stairs, Leo padding silently behind him. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the familiar space feel alien and threatening. He'd been avoiding this moment for 3 days, ever since finding Margaret's journal hidden in the portrait's frame. The pages had revealed a horror that made his grandmother's careful silences finally make sense. Margaret Whitmore hadn't died in a farming accident in 1952. She'd been murdered by her own husband, Ezekiel, for threatening to expose his illegal polygamous marriages to 3 other women, unions that would have destroyed not only his standing in the community, but his profitable land dealings with the church. The journal's final entry, dated the day before her death, described Margaret's plan to confront the church elders. She'd discovered that Ezekiel had been using their farmhouse as a way station for other polygamous families fleeing persecution, charging them exorbitant fees and sometimes taking their daughters as additional wives. The portrait that had so captivated Leo wasn't just a family heirloom. It was Margaret's silent witness, positioned to watch over her unmarked grave. Jimboy knelt beside the spot where Leo had first started digging, running his fingers along the concrete seam his dog had somehow detected. The floor here was slightly different, the concrete a shade lighter and the texture rougher. His grandmother Evelyn had known. She'd lived her entire life walking over her aunt's body, keeping the secret that had kept her family safe. But someone else knew too. Someone who'd been watching him since he arrived, waiting to see if he'd discover what Leo's supernatural instincts had revealed. The sound of footsteps on the floor above made him freeze. Leo's ears perked up, but the dog didn't growl. Whoever was upstairs, he recognized them. Jimboy's blood turned to ice as he realized the implications. The person hunting him wasn't a stranger stalking from the shadows. It was someone Leo trusted. "Jimboy, you down there?" Sheriff Coleman's voice drifted down the basement stairs, casual and friendly as always. Coleman, the man who'd been so helpful, so understanding about Jimboy's adjustment period to rural life, who dismissed the threats as pranks and the break-ins as teenagers, who'd grown up in the valley and would have heard all the old stories about the Whitmore family. "Yeah, Sheriff, just checking on some plumbing." Jimboy's voice cracked slightly as he stood, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. He grabbed a wrench from his toolbox, trying to look busy. Coleman's boots appeared on the stairs, descending slowly. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, called. Said she saw lights down here pretty late last night. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay." Mrs. Henderson lived 2 miles away. There was no way she could see basement lights from her house. "Just trying to fix a leak," Jimboy said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "You know how these old houses are." Coleman reached the bottom of the stairs, his bulk filling the narrow space between the water heater and the foundation wall. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, and his eyes swept the basement with practiced efficiency. "Find anything interesting?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Jimboy caught the sharp edge underneath. "Just mouse droppings and spider webs." Jimboy gestured vaguely toward the corner where he'd been kneeling. "Nothing a little elbow grease can't handle." Coleman nodded slowly, then walked over to examine the concrete where Leo had been digging. The dog watched him approach, but remained calm, tail even wagging slightly. Funny thing about old foundations, sometimes they settle unevenly, create weak spots where things can surface. The words hung in the air like a threat. Jimboy realized that Coleman wasn't just here to silence him. The sheriff was here to retrieve Margaret's remains before they could be discovered by someone else, someone who might ask uncomfortable questions about why the investigation into her disappearance had been closed so quickly in 1952. "Sheriff Coleman?" Jimboy kept his voice carefully neutral. "How long has your family lived in the valley?" Coleman's smile was cold. "Long enough to understand that some secrets are better left buried. My grandfather was deputy sheriff when Margaret Whitmore went missing. Family stories get passed down through the generations, you understand, along with family responsibilities." The basement suddenly felt much smaller. Jimboy was trapped between Coleman and the stairs, with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. His cell phone had no reception down here, and the landline was upstairs in the kitchen. But Leo was moving now, positioning himself between Jimboy and the sheriff. The dog's friendly demeanor had vanished, replaced by something primitive and protective. His lips pulled back in a silent snarl, and the hair along his spine stood up like spikes. Coleman noticed the dog's change in behavior and took a step back, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "You know, Jimboy," he said softly, "maybe it's time we had ourselves a real conversation about your future plans for this property." The old mining tunnels stretched deeper into the mountain than Jimboy had imagined possible. Sarah's flashlight beam danced across rough-hewn walls that seemed to absorb the light, creating pockets of impenetrable darkness that could hide anything. The air grew thinner with each step, carrying the metallic taste of old blood and something else, something that made Leo whimper and press closer to Jimboy's legs. "The journal mentioned these tunnels," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Your great-great-grandfather Ezekiel wrote about them in his final entries. He said the mountain was hollow, like a skull." Jimboy ran his free hand along the tunnel wall, feeling the deliberate chisel marks carved into stone. "This isn't random mining. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for down here." The tunnel forked ahead, splitting into 3 separate passages. Sarah consulted the photocopied journal pages, squinting at Ezekiel's increasingly erratic handwriting. He drew a map on the last page. "We need to take the middle passage, but—" She hesitated, the flashlight trembling in her grip. "But what?" He wrote something here in the margin. It says, "They're still watching. Even in death they keep the covenant." A sound echoed from somewhere behind them. the scrape of boots on stone. Jimboy grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her into the middle tunnel. Leo bounded ahead, his golden fur disappearing into the darkness before reappearing at the edge of their light. The dog moved with purpose now, as if following a scent only he could detect. The passage narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Ancient wooden support beams creaked overhead, their surfaces black with age and moisture. Carved symbols decorated the walls at regular intervals, not the crude markings of miners, but deliberate religious iconography that predated the Mormon settlement of the valley. "Sarah," Jimboy breathed, stopping beside a particularly elaborate carving. "Look at this!" The symbol showed a tree with 13 branches, each ending in an eye. Beneath it, someone had carved words in what looked like Latin, though the letters were worn almost smooth. Sarah traced them with her finger, mouthing the syllables silently. "In blood we bind the generations," she translated finally. "What is sealed below shall not rise above." Leo barked once, sharp and urgent, from somewhere ahead. When they caught up to him, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Their combined flashlight beams couldn't reach the far walls, but they could see enough to make both of them step back in horror. Dozens of wooden coffins lined the chamber floor in perfect rows, their surfaces carved with the same tree and eye symbol. But these weren't ordinary burials. Heavy chains wrapped around each coffin, secured with massive iron padlocks that showed no signs of rust despite the chamber's dampness. Between the rows, tall stone monuments bore names and dates stretching back over a century. "It's a cemetery," Sarah whispered. "But why chain the coffins?" Jimboy moved closer to the nearest monument, reading the inscription aloud. "Matthias Whitmore, 1847 to 1889. Here lies one who broke the covenant. May his example keep the others faithful." Every monument told a similar story. Men and women who had broken the covenant or betrayed the sacred trust. The dates on the graves corresponded with mysterious disappearances Sarah had found in the historical records. People who had simply vanished from the community without explanation. They weren't buried here because they died, Jimboy realized with growing horror. They were buried here because they tried to leave, or because they threatened to expose whatever secret the covenant was protecting. Leo had moved to the far end of the chamber, where a single coffin sat apart from the others. This one bore no chains, no monuments. Instead, fresh flowers lay scattered across its wooden surface, roses that couldn't have been there more than a few days. Beside it, a modern camping chair and battery-powered lantern suggested someone had been keeping a vigil. Sarah picked up a folded piece of paper from the chair's seat. Her face went pale as she read it. "Jimboy, this is addressed to you." The note was written in the same handwriting they'd seen in the margins of Ezekiel's journal. "You've come far enough, James Whitmore. Your grandmother kept the secret for 70 years. She died because she finally decided to break her silence. The covenant protects this valley, protects all of us from what lies beneath. Turn back now, or join the others who chose poorly." A new sound echoed through the chamber, the mechanical click of a rifle being cocked. From the shadows beyond their flashlight beams, a figure emerged. It was Pastor Matthews from the local church, but his kindly demeanor had vanished, replaced by something cold and determined. "I hoped you'd listen to reason," he said, raising the rifle. "Your grandmother was a good woman, but she lost her faith in the end. She thought the world deserved to know the truth about Ezekiel's bargain." "What bargain?" Jimboy demanded, positioning himself between Sarah and the pastor. Matthews smiled, but his eyes remained dead, the one that keeps the Whitmore curse buried where it belongs. The cellar door slammed shut above them with a finality that made Jimboy's stomach drop. The heavy wooden beam sliding into place on the other side confirmed what he already knew. They were trapped. Leo whined and pressed against his legs, the dog's usual bravado replaced by trembling fear. "Well, this is just perfect," Sarah muttered, her voice echoing in the darkness. The beam from her flashlight swept across stone walls that seemed to close in around them with each passing second. Jimboy pulled out his phone, knowing what he'd find but hoping anyway. No signal. The thick stone walls and underground location made communication impossible. We need to find another way out. Or figure out what's down here that Bishop Thornfield is so desperate to hide, Sarah said, playing her light across the far wall. Look at this. The beam illuminated a series of wooden shelves built into alcoves, carved from the rock itself. But these weren't storing preserves or root vegetables. Stacks of leather-bound journals filled every available space, their spines cracked with age. Some bore dates going back to the 1880s. Others were unmarked entirely. Leo's hackles rose as they approached the shelves. The dog's nose twitched, picking up scents that made him back away with a low growl. Jimboy had learned to trust Leo's instincts completely. If the dog sensed something wrong here, there was definitely something wrong. Sarah pulled one of the journals from the shelf, handling it carefully as the brittle binding threatened to fall apart in her hands. She opened it to a random page and began reading silently, her expression growing more troubled with each line. "What is it?" Jimboy asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "It's a record," she said quietly. "Detailed accounts of punishments. People who spoke against the church leadership, who questioned certain practices." She flipped through several more pages. "Jimboy, some of these entries describe things that would have been considered crimes even back then." The temperature in the cellar seemed to drop several degrees. Jimboy grabbed another journal from a different shelf, this one newer looking. The handwriting was more modern, the ink still dark against the pages. His blood ran cold as he recognized some of the names mentioned, people from town who had supposedly moved away over the years or died in accidents. "Sarah, look at this." His voice came out as barely a whisper. "These aren't all historical records. Some of these entries are recent, very recent." She leaned over to see what he was reading, and he watched her face pale in the flashlight's glow. The journal in his hands contained meticulous records of surveillance, intimidation, and worse. People who had asked too many questions about missing family members. Researchers who had gotten too close to uncovering certain truths. Even a few federal investigators who had supposedly been transferred to other cases. "The pattern's been going on for over a century," Sarah breathed. "Generation after generation, keeping the same secrets, using the same methods." Leo's growling intensified, and they both turned to see what had caught his attention now. In the far corner of the cellar, partially hidden behind the shelving, was another alcove. This one was sealed with newer-looking stones, mortared into place much more recently than the rest of the cellar's construction. The smell hit them as they got closer, something sweet and sickly that made Jimboy's throat close up. Leo refused to go any nearer, backing away until he was pressed against the opposite wall. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said urgently. "We need to get these journals to the authorities, to someone outside the local chain of command who can—" The sound of footsteps above cut her off, multiple sets, moving purposefully across the kitchen floor. Voices murmured too quietly to make out words, but the tone was businesslike, efficient. These weren't people who had come to negotiate. Jimboy quickly began grabbing journals from the shelves, stuffing them into his jacket pockets. Sarah did the same, prioritizing the newer volumes that would be easiest to verify and investigate. They had perhaps minutes before whoever was upstairs decided to come down and deal with them permanently. "There has to be another way out," Jimboy whispered desperately. "These old houses always had multiple entrances to their cellars, in case of emergencies or—" "Here." Sarah's flashlight had found what looked like a wooden panel set into the wall near the sealed alcove. It was partially hidden by decades of accumulated dust and debris, but the outline was unmistakable. The footsteps above were moving toward the cellar door now. The voices were getting louder, more urgent. Jimboy could hear Bishop Thornfield's distinctive baritone giving what sounded like orders. Leo was already at the hidden panel, pawing frantically at the edges. Whatever lay beyond, the dog seemed to think it represented their only chance. Jimboy hoped Leo's survival instincts were as reliable as ever, because they were about to bet their lives on it. The cellar door above them creaked as someone began to lift the wooden beam. Behind them, Sarah's footsteps echoed softly. She'd insisted on coming despite his protests, clutching the leather journal they'd found upstairs. The pages contained his great-great-grandmother's careful handwriting, documenting a horror that the family had buried for over a century. "The wall should be here somewhere," Jimboy muttered, running his free hand along the rough stone foundation. His fingers traced the mortar joints, searching for the irregularity that would indicate a deliberate concealment. Leo's behavior grew more agitated as they moved deeper into the basement's shadows. The dog's ears flattened against his head, and he began that familiar, intense stare, the same one that had started this entire nightmare when he'd focused on the Mormon portrait upstairs. "Jimboy," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear, "look at Leo." The dog wasn't staring at the wall. He was fixated on something behind them, his body rigid with terror. A low growl rumbled deep in his throat, building in intensity. Jimboy spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping across the basement. The light caught movement near the stairs, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. His heart hammered against his ribs as the beam revealed a figure standing motionless in the darkness. Elder Morrison stepped into the light, his weathered face twisted with grim determination. In his gnarled hands, he held an old revolver, its barrel pointed directly at Jimboy's chest. "I warned you to leave well enough alone, boy." Morrison's voice carried the weight of decades. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Sarah gasped, instinctively moving closer to Jimboy. The journal trembled in her grip as Morrison's pale eyes fixed on it with unmistakable hunger. "You have something that belongs to the church," Morrison continued, his finger hovering near the trigger, "something that could destroy everything we've worked to build here." Jimboy's mind raced. The journal contained evidence of ritualistic murders committed by early church members, including Morrison's own ancestors. Women who dared to speak against certain practices had simply disappeared, their bodies hidden in spaces like the one concealed somewhere in these basement walls. "The families deserve to know the truth," Jimboy said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Those women had children, relatives who never learned what happened to them." Morrison's laugh was bitter and cold. "The truth? The truth is that sometimes righteousness requires sacrifice. Those women threatened the very foundation of our community. They had to be stopped." Leo's growling intensified, and the dog took a protective step in front of Jimboy and Sarah. Morrison's eyes flicked to the animal with obvious distaste. "That mutt started this whole mess. Should have put it down the moment it began acting strange." Morrison raised the revolver slightly. "But I can remedy that now." The basement suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around them. Jimboy could hear Sarah's rapid breathing behind him, could smell the musty odor of decades-old secrets seeping from the stone foundation. "You killed my grandmother," Jimboy said, the pieces finally falling into place. "She found the room, didn't she? She learned what really happened to those women." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his silence was confirmation enough. Jimboy felt rage building in his chest, hot and consuming. "She was going to expose everything," Morrison finally admitted. "After all these years, she developed a conscience. Said she couldn't live with the knowledge anymore." His grip tightened on the weapon. "I couldn't allow that." Behind Morrison, more shadows stirred. Other figures emerged from the darkness, church elders, their faces masks of solemn resolve. Jimboy recognized several of them from the funeral, men who'd offered condolences while knowing exactly how his grandmother had died. "There are too many of us, boy," Morrison said, noting Jimboy's desperate glances toward the stairs. "And we've had over a century of practice at making problems disappear." Leo suddenly lunged forward, his teeth bared in a snarl. Morrison stumbled backward, the revolver wavering as he tried to maintain his balance. In that instant of chaos, Jimboy saw their only chance. "The room," he shouted to Sarah. "Find the hidden room." He threw himself at Morrison while Sarah dove toward the wall, her hands frantically searching for the concealed entrance. Leo's barks echoed through the basement as other elders moved forward, their own weapons now visible in the flashlight's erratic beam. Jimboy's fingers closed around Morrison's wrist, fighting for control of the gun. The old man was stronger than he looked, his grip like iron forged by years of manual labor. Around them, the basement erupted into chaos as the other elders closed in, their century-old conspiracy finally exposed, but far from defeated. The cellar door splintered as Marcus threw his full weight against it, the rotted wood finally giving way after decades of moisture and neglect. Jimboy tumbled backward, his flashlight clattering across the stone floor as Marcus's massive frame filled the doorway above. "Should have left well enough alone, boy," Marcus wheezed, his breathing labored from the exertion. Blood seeped through his shirt where Leo had torn flesh, but the wound only seemed to fuel his rage. "Your grandmother understood. She kept her mouth shut for 60 years. Jimboy scrambled across the damp cellar floor, his hands searching desperately for the flashlight. The beam had landed, pointing toward the far wall, illuminating something that made his blood freeze. Wooden crates, dozens of them, stacked against the stone foundation. And carved into each crate's side was the same symbol from the portrait, the twisted tree with roots that looked too much like reaching fingers. "What is this place?" Jimboy's voice cracked as he backed against the wall, his fingers finally closing around the flashlight handle. Marcus descended the stone steps slowly, savoring each moment. "This is where it all began, where my great-grandfather and yours made their pact." He gestured toward the crates with something approaching reverence. The Mormon battalion found more than just a route to California in these mountains. They found something that had been waiting. The beam of Jimboy's flashlight swept across the nearest crate. Through gaps in the rotted slats, something gleamed, not gold, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air in the cellar felt thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were pressing inward. "The official records say the battalion was disbanded in Los Angeles," Marcus continued, pulling a knife from his belt. "But 12 men never made it that far, 12 men who saw what was hidden in these caves and decided it was worth more than any California gold rush." Above them, Leo's barking had grown frantic. The sound of splintering wood suggested the dog was tearing apart whatever Marcus had used to trap him upstairs. "They formed their own covenant," Marcus said, his eyes gleaming in the flashlight beam, "not with God, but with something older, something that promised prosperity in exchange for maintenance, for keeping the secret, for feeding it when necessary." Jimboy's mind reeled, the missing hikers over the decades, the way people avoided the mountain roads at night. The reason his grandmother had never wanted him to explore certain parts of the property. "The portrait isn't just a family heirloom," he whispered, understanding flooding through him. "It's a contract." Marcus smiled, the expression grotesque in the dancing shadows. "Smart boy." Jeremiah Kowalski was one of the 12. The portrait was painted with special pigments, blessed by something that doesn't belong in any Christian church. As long as it hangs in the house, as long as the bloodline continues, the covenant holds. The knife glinted as Marcus stepped closer. "But you had to go digging. Had to bring in that sheriff, start asking questions. The others are getting nervous. They think maybe it's time to let the Kowalski line end." A thunderous crash echoed from upstairs, followed by Leo's triumphant howling. The dog had broken free. "Leo!" Jimboy shouted, hoping to guide the animal toward the cellar. Marcus lunged forward, the blade slicing through the air where Jimboy's chest had been a moment before. Jimboy rolled sideways, his shoulder slamming into one of the crates. The impact sent tremors through the wooden structure, and something inside shifted with a sound like grinding bones. The temperature in the cellar plummeted. Frost began forming on the stone walls despite the summer heat outside. Marcus froze mid-swing, his eyes widening as he stared at the damaged crate. "No," he breathed. "It's not time. The feeding isn't due for another season." But whatever was contained in the crates had awakened. The darkness between the slats seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The smell of decay and something far worse filled the air, like burnt metal and rotten flowers. Leo's claws clicked rapidly across the floorboards above, and then the dog was bounding down the cellar steps, his fur standing on end. But instead of attacking Marcus, Leo positioned himself between Jimboy and the damaged crate, his growl taking on an almost supernatural resonance. Marcus backed toward the steps, his knife forgotten. "You don't understand what you've done. The Covenant kept it contained, kept it satisfied. Without the barriers, without the bloodline to maintain the binding. The wood of the damaged crate split further, and something that might have once been a hand pressed against the gap. But it had too many joints, too many fingers, and the flesh was the color of old parchment." "Run," Marcus whispered, his earlier malice replaced by genuine terror. "God help us all. Just run." The cellar filled with a sound like screaming wind, and every crate began to splinter simultaneously. The basement felt different now, as if the very walls had exhaled a breath they'd been holding for decades. Jimboy knelt beside the wooden crate they'd unearthed, his hands trembling as he lifted the final bundle of letters. The yellowed paper crackled between his fingers, and Leo pressed against his leg, no longer agitated but somehow satisfied, like a job well done. "Sarah Whitmore," Jimboy read aloud, his voice echoing in the suddenly peaceful space. "My dearest William, I fear this may be my final correspondence." Detective Martinez crouched beside him, her flashlight illuminating the faded ink. Above them they could hear the paramedics working on Bishop Crawley, his moans of pain a stark reminder of how close they'd all come to joining the farmhouse's collection of buried secrets. The letter continued in Sarah's careful script, detailing her growing suspicion that her husband suspected her friendship with William, Jimboy's great-great-grandfather. She wrote of hidden meetings in the old barn, of plans to leave together for California, of a love that transcended the rigid expectations of their Mormon community. "She never made it," Jimboy whispered, thinking of the woman in the portrait whose eyes had haunted this house for so long. He killed her before she could leave. Martinez nodded grimly. "And your ancestor helped cover it up. Look at this." She held up another document, a property deed showing how William Brennan had acquired additional farmland shortly after Sarah's disappearance. Blood money, paid to keep quiet about what he'd witnessed. Leo whined softly and padded over to the corner where they'd found the crate. His nose pressed against a loose stone in the wall, and when Jimboy investigated, he found one final item, a small silver locket. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the back, in fading ink, "For my beloved William, until we meet again." She really loved him, Jimboy said, closing the locket carefully. "All this time, she's been trying to tell her story." The sound of heavy footsteps on the basement stairs interrupted them. Sheriff Morrison descended, his face grim but relieved. "Crawley's stable, broken ribs, concussion, but he'll live to stand trial. He's already asking for a lawyer." "What made him crack like that?" Martinez asked. "I mean, this all happened over a century ago. Why kill for it now?" Morrison shrugged. "Pride, I guess. Fear. His family's been prominent in the church for generations. If word got out that his great-grandfather was a murderer, that the Crawley name was built on blood money and covered-up crimes," he gestured at the letters scattered around them. "Some people value reputation more than human life." Jimboy carefully gathered the letters, feeling their weight, not just physical but emotional. These weren't just historical documents, they were Sarah's voice, finally free after more than a century of silence. Her story of love and loss, of a woman trapped by societal expectations and destroyed by a jealous husband's rage. "The portrait," he said suddenly, remembering how it had all started. Leo kept staring at it, because he could sense something, couldn't he? Dogs are supposed to be sensitive to things we can't understand. As if summoned by his words, Leo trotted back over and sat calmly beside Jimboy, his tail wagging slightly. The manic intensity that had driven him to scratch at walls and whine at empty corners was completely gone. Whatever presence had lingered in this house seemed finally at peace. 3 hours later, after the police had catalogued everything and Crawley had been taken to the hospital under guard, Jimboy found himself alone in the farmhouse. The portrait still hung above the mantel, but Sarah's eyes no longer seemed tortured. If anything, she looked grateful. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. How's the renovation going? Fixed that leaky roof yet? Jimboy almost laughed. The roof seemed like such a trivial concern now. He'd come to Utah thinking he'd inherited a simple farmhouse with basic maintenance issues. Instead, he'd uncovered a murder that had echoed through generations, nearly gotten himself killed, and solved a mystery that had haunted his family for over a century. But looking around the house now, really looking, he could see its potential. The hardwood floors were solid beneath the years of grime. The stone fireplace was beautifully crafted. The windows, once cleaned, would flood the rooms with natural light. This house had good bones, despite the darkness it had harbored. Tomorrow, he would call the local historical society about donating Sarah's letters. Her story deserved to be told, her memory honored. Tonight, though, he would simply sit with Leo by the fireplace and appreciate the profound silence that had settled over the farmhouse. For the first time since arriving in Utah, Jimboy felt truly at home. The secrets were finally free, and both the living and the dead could rest easy.